Howdy, folks. John here with my first book report, so to speak. Um, I am sharing with you The Upswing by Robert D. Putnam and Shaylyn Romney Garrett. I'm inspired to do this because when I renewed it at the library, I was able to renew it, and that means nobody had put it on hold, and that made me very sad because I think this book has some really valuable content and is worth reading. I'm going to start with a little bit of text right out of the book, page 19. Perhaps the single most important lesson we can hope to gain from this analysis is that in the past, America has experienced a storm of unbridled individualism in our culture, our communities, our politics, and our economics. And it produced then, as it has today, a national situation that few Americans found appealing. But we successfully weathered that storm once, and we can do it again. If ever there were an historical moment whose lesson we as a nation need to learn, then it is at the moment when the first American Gilded Age turned into the Progressive Era, a moment which set in motion a sea change that helped us reclaim our nation's promise and whose effects rippled into almost every corner of American life for over half a century. Understanding what set those trends in motion then becomes of critical importance, which leads us to the subtitle here: How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. So, really, there's a lot of details in here, but I'm just going to cover really the lessons that this analysis, that this book gleans from the transition from the last Gilded Age into the Progressive Era around 1900. And I'm going to start with a graph, which I assume is fair use, since it's just one tiny bit out of the book. And you'll notice all of these lines, the bottom. You have to get the book to get all the technical details, but basically the bottom of the graph represents trends in which things are more individualistic and less equal, more income inequality, all of that, and higher up represents more equal, less income inequality, less wealth inequality. And these are consolidations of many, many, many numbers that they've put together very meticulously. It's a very well-researched book, very scientific, and they don't over-promise. They definitely dig into the numbers and say, hey, we don't really know here, or we didn't have good numbers for this. So they're very conservative in how they put this together, and it's quite compelling that at the end of the last Gilded Age, things were quite similar to they are today in terms of inequality, individualism versus collective good, social good, and trends in terms of politics, society, and culture were amazingly parallel. But you know, something that the book really emphasizes over and over again is that correlation does not equal causation, and they say that over and over again. But it is quite interesting that the political, social, and cultural measures led economic equality. So politically, socially, culturally, America decided to be more in terms of social growth, social and togetherness. We're all in this together, and we built that in those realms, and then the economic followed, but then on the downswing, where we went back into more individualistic, less equal. The economics tended to lead just a little bit. It's very interesting. So most of the book deals with those trends, how they came up with those lines and all those numbers. But the last chapter is quite fascinating and really sums up some of the lessons that hopefully we can learn and get out of our second Gilded Age here. One of the first key lessons, they call it from privilege to passion, and what that implies is that upper middle class, for the most part, wealthier Americans saw the horrors and abuses of the Gilded Age and reacted to it by organizing, by attacking it head on. Many of these were women, such as Jane Addams, who dealt with immigrants and urban poor. Florence Kelley, who worked on labor reform, children's rights, racial equality. Children were often worked to an early grave, a mere 120 years ago. Many people were not aware of that. Lillian Wald worked on human rights and health care, and John Dewey, who promoted education to make people more engaged with democratic citizenship, which I think is a key problem today. People feel disempowered, like they can't make a difference, but you can, I can, we can make a difference. There's no question. The next lesson, from isolation to association. And so here they're talking about social, religious, and other types of groups where people get together and build community. One of their main examples was Paul Harris, who founded the Rotary Club. Literally hundreds of associations, groups, clubs were formed during the Progressive Era at a far higher rate than any other time in American history. Very, very interesting. I would also add that AA, the 12-step programs, started around then as well. Yet another example of we versus I. Not that there's anything wrong with I. I'll get to that in a minute. The next lesson they glean from the Progressive Era was from darkness into light. Basically, talking about media, which back then was predominantly journalism, books and journalism, for the most part radio, using media to expose the truth, honest media. Back then they were called muckrakers, people like Ida B. Wells, Lincoln Steffens, Jacob Riis, Ida Tarbell, Upton Sinclair, and Ray Stannard Baker. I think some of this has started already, hopefully leading into a second Progressive Era, but we need a lot more of it, and we need to call out the dishonest media that propagates lies, misinformation, unscientific and unsubstantiated facts, supposed facts, non-facts, lies, I should say. The next lesson, from tycoon to transformative leader. So another interesting bit from the book that was kind of new to me, at least explicitly, was the idea that it's not either or with grassroots or top down. The Progressive Era really succeeded when you had both. Leadership that could use the grassroots, the power and energy and ideas from the grassroots, and build that into broad coalitions that can actually make real political change. And to keep at it, right? Most progressive reforms failed the first time, but then the second or third time they succeeded. another key piece to that is that most of the really successful progressive ideas that were implemented nationally were originally done at the state or local level. Really, creative, empowered local leaders experimenting, trying things out, and finding things that work, and then those good ideas that actually work, bubbling up to the national level. Another lesson they call moral awakening, which basically means not to shy away from the ethical and moral implications of some of the worst abuses of the first and second, and in our case, second Gilded Age. Another piece to that is also that that you do need tolerance, right? So you need to state the moral case, but then not demonize people who might have advocated for some of those things in the past. The success of the progressive era involved broad coalitions that included people that might have been on the other side of the issue a mere 10, 20 years earlier. So you don't want to demonize, in our case, perhaps, say, Trump supporters. They could be allies in the near future, right? Some of them, anyway, right? So, ethics and morals, but in a gray sort of way, not black and white, right? Nobody's all bad and nobody's all good, and we all can learn and grow and change, right? So, anyway, another lesson they call civic revival. So, basically, the power of collective action. The power of we, right? So an individual really can't get a whole lot done at the social level, societal level, but a group of us can, right? Another they call groundswell. Again, the importance of the grassroots gives robustness and energy to various movements. Like I mentioned earlier, many times they failed the first time, but because they were based on grassroots energy, they kept at it and eventually succeeded. So, political response, again, this kind of gets back to bottom up and top down. You need those, and I love this phrase, you political entrepreneurs. So you do need political thinkers and actors that can take that grassroots and build it into broad coalitions to actually get stuff done. Another piece they found in the first progressive era was youth-driven. So most progressive reformers and writers found their voice and power in their 30s or younger. Our most famous progressive president, Teddy Roosevelt, was also our youngest president, 42 when he took office. They do have an overreach, a cautionary tale, they call it, on prohibition. So prohibition obviously came from good intentions, but it was definitely an overreach, a social, really an extreme form of social control that was not the right way to approach the problems of drunkenness and addiction. And I think it's really telling that when you're building broad coalitions, the importance of the loyal opposition is very important to prevent those sorts of overreaches, which leads us right into the next issue, which is individualism versus community. So they actually call that curve I showed you, they call it the I, we, I curve, right? So the first Gilded Age was very much an I era, and then into World War II and the 50s, early 60s, you had the peak of what they call the we era, and then we went back into sort of an I era again. And so they talk about individualism versus community as sort of a way to look at these shifts. But very intelligently, I think, and I completely agree with this, they view it as a false dichotomy, right? It's not really either or. It's both and, right? I mean, individual rights, of course, are very important, but they're not everything, right? And collective rights are important too, and we need both. But extremism, in my view, is the real problem, right? So extreme individualism, that's a problem. Extreme social collectivism, that's a problem too, right? Look at prohibition, right? It went too far. And so you need the middle, you need the compromises to come up with the good solutions there. And so that dynamic between individualism and community is something that they found. And that's really the core of the lessons that they find from the first progressive era. And I will finish here with actually a quote out of the book by Teddy Roosevelt. Quote, "The fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together." So thanks for your time, and I highly recommend anyone interested in these issues and how we can co-create a second progressive era to follow the second Gilded Age. Please, and so that we don't all sink together, that we all thrive and build a better future together. I think this book gives a well-researched roadmap on how to put that together, and I think it's well worth your time.